August 1939. A month before the invasion of Poland and the ultimate beginning of World War II, the Soviet Union and Germany, the two leading powers in Europe at the time, signed a non-aggression treaty that would create a temporary alliance between the two powers, and would then attack the Poles from either side of the country to capitulate it with speed. This agreement, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, brought relief to the leader of the Soviets, Joseph Stalin, who was wary of another conflict with Germany from the time that Hitler ascended to power. Accordingly, he mustered forces on the eastern borders of Poland, while the Germans did the same on the west. However, the agreement had been a mere ploy devised by Hitler to buy him time in the east while he carried out his submission of the Western Allies, after which he intended to purge the Soviet Union's land of what he considered to be the inferior Untermensch. After Poland capitulated, its territory was split in two. The Germans would keep the west, while the Soviets would have control over the east. For a time, this was the end of hostilities on the Eastern Front. After Hitler's conquest of France in early 1940, and his failed attempts at an amphibious invasion of England later that year, Hitler set his sights on the Soviet Union, which he saw as becoming a greater threat daily. He saw the vast steppes and plains, as well as the abundant natural resources of the country, as a prize which would finally enable the German people to become the master race. Throughout the early months of 1941, as he stayed at his Alpine retreat in Bavaria, Hitler planned his greatest gamble, the invasion of Soviet Russia. Slowly, the Wehrmacht's manpower was redeployed to the eastern border with the Soviets, and re-equipped and refitted for what would be their greatest challenge. Stalin was, on paper, still the ally of the Germans. He intended to preserve this alliance as long as he could, knowing the grave consequences of a German invasion against his ill-prepared military, battered by a series of purges against high-ranking officers carried out years ago. 3/4 of his senior officers had been shot or imprisoned. Day by day, as German forces gathered on the Soviet border, Stalin ordered that nothing should be done to offend Hitler, lest it trigger unwarranted attention. These orders proved to be in vain, for on June the 22nd, 1941, despite doubts from all his high command that the plan could possibly succeed, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Its goal was to annihilate the country, seize its lifeblood, oil, and exterminate its masses. In order to take the Red Army by storm, the Germans split their army into three groups, which targeted key regions of the Soviet Union in order to cripple their infrastructure and economy as quickly as possible. Army Group North was assigned to seize Leningrad after overrunning the Baltics. Army Group Center headed on a direct path to Moscow, while Army Group South would occupy the Ukraine. Hitler's generals were concerned that the plan would spread their forces thin and make for a logistical nightmare, but none voiced their concerns. Despite the Soviets' numerical advantage, both in manpower and tanks, the Red Army tended to be far less well equipped, and most of the equipment that they did possess was outdated or unreliable. The issue for the Germans was utilizing their technological superiority and comparatively mechanized military to overwhelm the Soviets before the sheer number of the Red Army ground them down. The initial blow by the Germans was spectacular. As the German armies lumbered past the under-equipped and under-trained Soviets, they took hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Vast columns trudged west to captivity. Over 2.5 million never returned. Army Group Center barreled through the Soviets, taking Minsk and Smolensk and making their way to within 200 miles of Moscow. However, the Soviets were getting progressively more resistant. Now having mobilized over 16 million men and being equipped with new weapons of war, they had begun to overwhelm the German military. Army Group Center, leaving the invasion of Moscow, was ordered to swing down south to assist Army Group South in the capture of Kiev. Taking advantage of this opportunity and heeding intelligence reports that described no intent of aggression by the Japanese in Siberia, Stalin ordered some 30 divisions, expertly trained in winter combat, across the Trans-Siberian Railroad to the defense of Moscow. There, commanded by the genius of Marshal Zhukov, they staved off the German advance, which was now battered by severe delays and attrition from warfare and the brutal cold. The German lines now fell at an unprecedented rate. The Russian winter caused great degrees of attrition to the ill-equipped German troops, many of whom died in droves from starvation and disease. After seeing the widespread retreat of his armies, Hitler ordered that there would be no retreat, and that every German soldier should fight until his last breath, even if it meant the sacrifice of an entire division. It worked. The German lines stabilized for the first time in months, yet now they faced a stalemate that would wither the inferior numbers of the Wehrmacht down very quickly. Eager to advance once more, and informed by his economic advisors that Germany's oil supplies were running low, Hitler turned his attention to the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus. This new operation, named Fall Blau, envisaged Army Group South B moving through the Caucasus, while Army Group South A covered its northern flank by the Don River. Now, Hitler made a series of blunders. He ordered Army Group South A to capture the city of Stalingrad along the river Volga, even though it had little strategic significance. This would pave the way to one of the bloodiest battles of the Second World War. By the end of July, the German armies had managed to push the Soviets across the River Don, leaving the Germans a mere 50 kilometers from Stalingrad. The 6th Army advanced at a rapid rate, while the 4th Panzer Army rejoined Army Group South A in its attack on Stalingrad. The Soviets, understanding German intentions, appointed Marshal Andrei Yeryomenko and General Vasily Chuikov in charge of the defense of the city. During this period of time, the Soviets committed 3 armies to hastily attack the northern flank of the Germans. Though it came at a cost of 200,000 casualties, it slowed down the German advance a considerable amount. Yet still, on August the 23rd, the 6th Army had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad, pursuing the 62nd and 64th Soviet armies, who had now retreated into the city. With the Germans now preparing a siege of Stalingrad, Stalin, true to his scorched earth policy, ordered the removal of anything that could be used by the Germans should they capture the city, including food, clothes, and basic medicine. As civilians, realizing their fates, desperately tried to vacate the city, they were ordered to remain and fight, as Stalin believed it was the duty of every Soviet citizen to defend their homeland, something which condemned hundreds of thousands in the city to certain death. As a result of the evacuation of the food stores, little remained for the defenders and citizens of the city. The Luftwaffe sprung into action shortly after Army Group South A was positioned around the city. German dive bombers sunk as many as 32 Soviet cargo ships within a span of 6 days. Following this, General Oberst Wolfram von Richthofen's Luftflotte 4 commenced a massive bombing campaign of the city, successfully dropping over 1,000 tons of bombs within 2 days. A massive firestorm ravaged the city, fueled by heavy winds and explosions in gasoline lines, and decimated the city's infrastructure.
In 23rd of August 1942, in this date was the most terrible, it was a very terrible bombardment of German aviation. In this date counted 500,000 citizens. And in last day of the battle, in the 2nd of February 1943, our NKVD counted all survivors in Stalingrad, and it was survived 32,000 people, not more than 4% of all population of Stalingrad.
Soviet attempts at regaining air superiority were futile, as air bases around Stalingrad lost some 201 aircraft in their sorties against the Germans, having only about 192 left by the end, a mere 42 of which were fighters. As the Germans pushed their way through the northern Volga, they were met with severe resistance. The 16th Tank Corps conducted a massive counterattack on September the 5th, but this was brushed aside by the 6th Army. As the Germans attacked in a pincer through the northwestern end of the city, the Soviets formed a defensive ring formation at the western end, forming strong points in any building that remained standing and turning the streets of the city into no man's land.
In Stalingrad was born street fighting tactics. I told you about short distance between German and Soviet soldiers, and in Stalingrad this tactics was very popular. The German soldiers didn't like these tactics because they wanted to use artillery, aviation. It was more comfortable for them. For Soviet soldiers, it was a lone method for surviving in Stalingrad.
By September the 12th, the 62nd Army had fallen back into the urban core of the city and had been whittled down to a mere 20,000 infantry, 90 tanks, and 700 artillery cannons. In the face of this, the Germans pushed through the blocks of the city where Soviet resistance had faltered, forming a deep salient in the Soviet lines. Though this was initially successful, reinforcements brought across the Volga stabilized the defensive lines and brought the offensive to a halt. The city's railway stations changed hands nearly 14 times within 6 hours, and the 13th Guards Rifle Division of the Soviets was completely annihilated by the end of the day. Elsewhere, at the Mamayev-Kurgan grain elevator, 50 Red Army defenders held off 10 assaults for 3 days before running out of ammunition and committing suicide. Despite their best efforts, by the 27th of September, with Germany's military might bearing down upon the city, the Soviets had been pushed into one narrow pocket along the southern bank of the Volga. Snipers fired upon any who dared enter the streets, and tank and heavy artillery thundered throughout the day, turning the landscape into a hellish ruin. After a further month of slow fighting, the Germans had cut off the two Soviet armies from each other, trapping them into two narrow pockets along the river Volga. In all, the 6th Army had lost 60,548 men, and the Soviets twice this number. As winter approached, ice floes prevented transports from crossing the Volga, and supplies were scarce for the Soviets. General Chuikov vividly remembered the effect this had on the Russian defenders many years later. The heavy casualties, the constant retreat, the shortage of food and munitions, and the difficulty of receiving reinforcements, all this had a very bad effect on morale. Many longed to get across the Volga, to escape the hell of Stalingrad. These successes in Stalingrad made German High Command overconfident, and large amounts of supplies were diverted to Army Group South A in the Caucasus. Taking advantage of this window, the Soviets sent Marshal Zhukov, the man responsible for the defense of Moscow, to commandeer a counterattack at Stalingrad. He noticed that the Germans' northern flank was well defended, though their western and eastern flanks were poorly guarded by auxiliary Romanian divisions. On November the 19th, 1942, with over 1 million men, 16,000 tanks, and hundreds of heavy artillery guns, Operation Uranus, as the counterattack was named, launched an offensive to outflank and encircle the Germans inside the city. A pelting of heavy and rocket artillery was followed by a tank and mechanized infantry group charging across the German flanks. One Russian group, comprised of the 1st, 5th, and 21st Armies, attacked the Romanian 4th Army to the north, and 1 day later, another group, consisting of the 57th, 64th, and 51st Armies, attacked the Romanian 3rd Army to the south. The pincers met at the town of Kalach, having encircled the bewildered German attackers and turning the tide of the battle. Some 265,000 men were now encircled within the city. Receiving news of the situation, German High Command ordered General Paulus in Stalingrad to stay put and wait for reinforcements to break the Soviet ring and perform an extraction. Army Group Don, under Field Marshal von Manstein, was sent forth from the eastern Ukraine in order to perform this task. Should the plan work, Army Group South A within the city would have to be sufficiently equipped to link up at Manstein, something which Hermann Göring, a chief of the Luftwaffe, suggested could be done entirely by airlift. Wolfram von Richthofen, a general within Stalingrad, repeatedly attempted to get the decision overturned, as the supply requirements, 750 tons, were far greater than the maximum that could be delivered by the Luftwaffe in a day, 107 tons. As Manstein learned of the impossibility of this, he suggested to Hitler that the Army Group South A be taken out of the city through a small pocket, losing Stalingrad but preventing the loss of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. However, Hitler was adamant. there would be no surrender of Stalingrad. As thus, the supply condition grew progressively worse, and though the Luftwaffe managed to ferry out about 30,000 men from the encirclement, the 3 German-controlled air bases near the city were taken out by the Soviet 24th Tank Corps, and now the Germans within the city were all but undersupplied and stuck in grueling winter conditions. Many were forced to eat dead horses or the corpses of their fallen, causing disease to go rampant. A soldier in these conditions stated in his diary, "My hands are done for, and have been ever since the beginning of December. The little finger of my left hand is missing, and what's even worse, the 3 middle fingers of my right one were frozen." As Manstein finally arrived in the city on December the 27th, he was unable to link with the tired and shattered troops within the city, and was forced to fall back. Unsuccessful, he was redeployed to other parts of the offensive to assist there. General Paulus, enraged at the terrible conditions in which his men were forced to fight, pleaded with German High Command for the authority to surrender, but the response was the same. He was to hold out till the last man. They believed that every day the soldiers in Stalingrad held out was another day that the Soviets were diverted from other fronts, and so Army Group South A was forced to continue their resistance. Tanks were no longer used, as debris and rubble had cramped the streets of the city to a great extent. On the 22nd of January, General Paulus once again pleaded for the authority to surrender, but he was yet again rejected. On the 24th, he recorded 18,000 men wounded without any hope of medical care. A surprise raid on the morning of January 31st, 1943, allowed the Soviets to breach the remaining German defenses and reach their headquarters. Later that day, General von Paulus finally surrendered to the Red Army, citing Hitler as a Bohemian corporal who had nothing to do with strategy. Over 91,000 soldiers were taken into prisoner of war camps. Though the battle had finally concluded, its tragic and blood-stained legacy lived on. Almost 2 million individuals were killed in the battle, including hundreds of thousands of civilians that were unnecessarily forced to stay in the city. Survivors were left traumatized, and many suffered from PTSD following the battle. Despite this, Stalingrad was a turning point of the war for the Allies. For Germany, the loss was immense. Having been assured a victory in Stalingrad, when news came of defeat at the city, citizens, generals, and even Hitler lost trust in Germany's military potential. Hitler, as a result, took control of all battle plans and troop movements in the months to come, causing some horrendous tactical decisions to be made on Germany's part.
If Stalingrad fall, it was a signal for Japan attacked Soviet borders in Far East, and of course it was a signal for Turkey start an offensive operation in Soviet Caucasus. And so, of course, the Soviet and modern Russian historians also they thought that the Stalingrad is the start of turning point. Maybe Kurskaya battle continued this crucial, not critical turning point, finish this turning point of war operation during World War II.
Had Germany been able to achieve a victory, Stalin would most likely lose the crucial oil fields in the Caucasus, forcing him to surrender and allowing the Wehrmacht to refocus all its strength onto one front in the West, bolstered by resources gained from the conquest of the Soviet Union, complicating matters for the Western Allies significantly. Though the Battle of Stalingrad saw the worst loss of human life in recorded military history, at 2 million men dead, it triumphantly served as a beacon of hope in a time where the Germans' advance was thought to be unstoppable and displayed the resolve and resilience of the Soviet Union, finally turning the advantage over to the Allies.